Describing meditative states can be very difficult because the dimensions of our awareness seem to be literally increased from our relative waking state. And those dimensions of awareness are always there in our waking state, in our normal state, during activities of everyday living. But we're simply not acutely aware of them. In my experience with meditation, there are at least two fundamental states, and they're very closely related to each other, but also almost polar opposites in a way. But you can't really have one without the other. They don't seem to be talked about very often. Certainly not by beginner meditators. But there's also the various language that we use to talk about these states. So when we are at the very beginning of our journey in meditation, for most of us, if we're very early on the path, thinking is very much a barrier, or at least it's a perceived barrier. In reality, it's not a barrier at all. Because the thoughts are incorporated into the experience. They're not rested. It's not a failure of not being able to not think, but a failure of not expanding our awareness. It's not the thoughts that are a barrier. They're not a barrier at all. And that's very difficult for beginners to understand or accept. But over time, it does become much more clear. But once thinking is no longer perceived as a barrier, when we stretch our awareness beyond thinking, then we become aware of the energy in our body, our emotions, and there's an aspect of surrender to this. So we're no longer we're not projecting anything. We're just saying, what is there? What is already here right now? What is already here? So of the two states I just described, I'll describe the first, which is the void. This is not the void as I've heard it been described in many non-duality discussions. This is different. Or at least it's deeper than the superficiality of simply eliminating the chattering of the ego. So this is a meditative state. It could conceivably be experienced during ordinary life, during activities of daily living, but I think for the vast majority of us, that's not a relevant possibility because it doesn't really happen like that. But during meditation, it certainly can. During ordinary living, it's relatively more rare. But the void is devoid of anything. And yet your perception is still there, so it's not quite a complete emptiness. People really abuse the word emptiness a lot, or nothingness, but nothingness in particular. That word is especially abused in discourse. People don't really seem to understand what nothingness is. Nothingness is, it's not even just a shadow or darkness. It's nothing. It's not even that. If you were to close one eye, there's an apparent blank or darkness or shadowy perception in what is normally that field of vision, but that's not nothingness. Because there's still a perceptual field that is lacking much, if any, incoming sensory data. True nothingness is beyond that. Can you speak about nothingness? You can't speak about nothingness. If you were to ask, what can you see from the eye in the back of your head? Well, I don't have one. And there's nothing there because I don't have one. Of course. There's not even the germ of the perception. So that's how, and maybe this is obvious, but we have to consider these things in depth before if we're going to use words like that. But the experience of the void, there is something there. But there's so little perception. In the void, there really is only the perception of the perception. So what I perceive happening is, when we're in this state, internal and external stimuli seem to equilibrate with each other. And so the mind and body become sort of balanced with each other, so to speak. And then consciousness becomes so silent and so still, it's as if it's a pin balanced on its head in a vast, dark room. The stillness is that deep. And it certainly scales. There's a depth to it. But once you get beyond thinking, then, and you go deeper and deeper and allow your senses to take you there. The other meditative state, I generally call the light, because that's what it is. But it's not a natural light that's, like the light that's illuminating this room. This light is I wouldn't want to get too much on a scientific level, but it appears to be sort of like a light that's not on the visible spectrum. But I can't say much more than that. It's a light that comes from the inside. So you could be meditating in a dark room but then you become illuminated from the inside. And it's extremely beautiful. The light seems to be love when the self is perceiving itself unconditionally, then that light appears. And this experience too is scalable. So you can have very small glimpses, sort of like and it's very subtle, sort of like a candle flame flickering in a dark room. How a candle flame can sort of it can cast these subtle dancing shapes and figures on the wall. And that's sort of what it's like inside. But as I said, it scales, so that intensity can grow. And it can grow to the point where you're engulfed in it. Or you're engulfed in this light that is love and your essential self. It is unconditional love. And it flows into every space of your perception. No atom of your being is left out. Not even a mother could love her child as much as it loves you. It's the larger, more expanded aspect of who you are. It's always there. It's always there, and it'll never leave. sometimes those experiences, as it might sound, they can be rather profound and leave you with tears streaming down your face. And those are the two main ones that I've encountered: the void and the light. And there are various other states. And essentially, meditative states are as diverse as the individual. Years ago, I learned the Transcendental Meditation technique, and I was trying to grasp what the meditative state was supposed to be that they were trying to teach us. And I asked my teacher directly, and he basically said, it depends on the individual. It's, really depends on you. And so beyond the silence and the calmness of the experience, it's kind of nondescript. And that was just a part of the teaching. Of course, in Transcendental Meditation, or TM as they call it, the point is simply to become calm and de-stress and derive practical benefits. Whereas here, I'm speaking about meditation in a much broader sense. In meditation, we can have all sorts of perceptions. Sensation of seeing colors that you've never seen before, for instance. The experience of sinking inward. Or collapsing into your cheeks or into your spine. Having all of your senses come together in sort of a single perception. And these states they're not necessarily individual states. They can be perceived simultaneously. It's also the feeling of oneness. That's oneness isn't a meditative state per se. Oneness is the case all the time. But when we talk about oneness, really we're talking about, well, me, at least I am, generally, I'm referring to the experience, the perception that allows one to conclude that it's all one. So when I'm in my ordinary waking day, like I'm, making breakfast or something, I don't have, I have the perception that I'm this human and there are all these separate objects here. On some level, there is a perception that it's all one. But in meditative states, we potentiate this experience so that it's obvious. It's like all the separation just falls away. But even that experience is relative. Because there's someone perceiving that experience. So there's you and then there's the experience. So the oneness and the separation, they go hand in hand, basically.